From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the latest instalment of the Psych Health and Safety Podcast live panel events. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the regular podcast. Last year, we ran 6 of these events, so it should give you an idea of how busy our year has been, that this is our first live panel and it's November. Suffice it to say, this will be the only live panel for 2022, and we will try and do much better next year. The topic for today is workplace health and safety psych regulations, potential pitfalls and considerations, and we'll feature 3 subject matter experts with significant experience in the industry. But before we introduce our guests, let me introduce my regular podcast co-host and moderator for today, Joelle Mitchell. Come onto the stream. How are you today, Joelle?
Swell. How are you, Jason?
Terrific. Like this is, yeah, we did this 6 times last year. Can you believe it?
I know. It's it's just weird that it's November, the end of November.
Yeah, probably should have listened to our marketing person who said we need a marketing calendar so we don't forget to do these things. So yeah, next year we'll try better, listeners. I've got a meeting with Brendan, our marketing person, this week. We'll get a marketing calendar. We'll make sure we have some more live events for you next year. But look, before we get on to today and introduce our amazing panelists, and it's really an all-star cast today, we've got a big announcement to share around Flourish DX, don't we?
Yes, it's fairly significant for us.
Well, Daniel, and we all know that Daniel's a bit of a Debbie Downer. He reckons it's nothing new, but it's a new thing that we're bringing to market. So look, many regular listeners of the podcast would know that we have a product called Flourish DX, and it's essentially technology that helps organizations measure psychosocial risk and monitor hazards quickly and at scale. While what people generally aren't aware of is that we offer a comprehensive suite of consulting and training services too on the topic of psych health and safety. So from strategy design to compliance gap analysis to qualitative risk assessments to action planning, functional team training and more. But what I guess we've been talking about, Joelle, a fair bit here, and we've been commenting on LinkedIn a bit, is that there really is a significant lack of subject matter expertise in the area. And Flourish DX customers now can purchase packages of consulting days to use on a menu of services with discounts for multi-year agreements as well. So the best thing is that through our proven ability to deliver services at scale is that our consulting is about half the cost of what I've seen other consultants charging for similar services. So it's always been about how do we actually get this to be widespread and scalable. We also obviously save employee time, which is another cost through our Flourish DX tools, which make consulting with people a lot quicker than traditional tools that are out there. So listeners, if you ever thought that the likes of Joelle and Alicia was out of reach for you to work with on a consulting basis, think again. We'll be putting a lot more information out on this, and the new Psych Health and Safety as a subscription service model from next week, starting with an expert series podcast that Joelle and I will record in the coming days. If you want to beat the stampede, DM myself, Joelle, or Alicia if you'd like to set up a conversation and discuss your 2023 strategy. But that's probably enough shameless self-promotion for today, hey, Joelle?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, we probably should introduce our panelists, and they're waiting patiently in the background. So
they didn't realise you were going to do this, so they're feeling trapped now.
I feel that's probably on you rather than me because you organised the panel, right?
Well, you just decided today that you were going to add this bit in.
No, I told you. I'm sure I told you a week ago. Anyway, this is why we need a marketing calendar. So let's introduce the first of our amazing 3 panelists. Naomi Kemp is the Australian Institute of Health and Safety Board Chair, expert member of the Queensland Government Workplace Health and Safety Board, and Managing Director of Safe Expectations. How are you today, Naomi?
I'll go with gnarly.
Gnarly.
Joelle was small.
I hope our next person is grouse. There's some words I haven't heard in a while. So yeah. Great. So great to have you on, Naomi. You're actually a first-time Psych Health and Safety podcast guest.
I am. First-time caller, long-time listener. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and a live panel. We're expecting, upwards of 500 people to jump on as well. So
not unexpected because it's such a hot topic. There's so many questions that everyone has, even us 3 sitting on the panel.
Yeah, terrific. And listening to some of the pre-conversation before the panel started, yeah, I think there's some definitely things that, there isn't a clear answer on, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you discuss. Our next panelist is actually a regular podcast guest, Wade Needham. In fact, he was actually the original podcast guest on episode number 2 of the Psych, Health and Safety podcast. He's a general manager, EHS, at Integral ESG Advisory. How are you today, Wade?
Very good, mate. Overwhelmed, actually, based upon the petition I have to push Christmas back, and everyone could do a little bit more this year because it seems like no one has enough time.
Seriously, it's November and this is our first live panel. I cannot believe how quickly this year's gone.
Keeps rolling around, but it's always a surprise.
Yeah, no, I'll sign that petition, mate. Just send it over my way. So yeah, plenty more to do this year. But great to have you back on. And our third panelist is also a pretty regular guest now on the podcast, an early guest, and has been on since. Dr. Beck McCulloch. How are you today, Dr. Beck?
Look, brilliant. And to be really frank, I know that we're all evidence-based practitioners, but gee, if we could find a way to make 24 hours of the day be 27, I don't know, 28, that would be really good. That'd be cool.
I don't know. I think, work overload being a psych hazard that we'll probably talk about at some time today. That might become an issue if you start extending the day further. But Beck, sorry for butchering your name again, Dr. McCulloch.
Oh, look. Go Joel.
Just Dr. Beck's is fine. Everyone, it's Dr. Beck's. It's that's fine. Look, I've been
Jason, are you disappointed now that nobody's feeling grouse?
Yeah, I was feeling grouse, but not anymore. Look, to the listeners, just to let you know how we're going to be running. We're going to be running about an hour fireside discussion. Hopefully these guys can moderate themselves. I'm yet to be confident in that. We'll see. And then we'll have questions from the audience for around about 30 minutes. I'll be in the background moderating the live chat on YouTube. So make sure you put in your questions and we'll hopefully get to them as many possible in the last 20 to 30 minutes. So I'm going to duck out. I will be hanging around the background as I like to lurk. And I'll hand over to Joelle to kick off the proceedings.
Thank you, Jason. Apologies, listeners, if this is your first time with experiencing Jason, but it is what it is. Only so much we can do. He does also have control of the banners, so we'll just need to be careful what we say about him. Right, so Beck, you actually suggested the topic and the panel for this webinar. So what was going on? What were you noticing that led you to make the suggestion?
There were probably, I'll call it 3 things. There was at a generic level, there was this increase in media in general. So there's been some things going through legislation. There's been a little bit of, and admittedly limited. We know that work health and safety doesn't necessarily get a lot of airtime per se, and HR probably gets more airtime, but probably less deserved. But there was a generic increase in people being interested about the sorts of issues that we're going to talk about. The second thing was actually, and probably the more influential one, was looking at professional conversations. So on platforms like LinkedIn, I saw like a really big uptick, particularly once the new regulations came into play, of this is an issue, these are the things you need to do this, do that. And a side panel to that is noticing a lot of what I call snake oil that goes with many of these, conversations. And the third one, which is probably again a minor issue compared to the second one, which is existing and in touch clients that were saying, we just want to touch base with you and make sure that we're doing what we need to do in this space, and making sure that we're on top of it and we're ahead of the game. So those were the 3 things. There was general media, there was professional media, and interest in conversations that raised a few alarm bells for me. And then there was clients also talking about it. So I thought, well, you know what, let's get out there and make sure that people understand what these regs really mean in practice. Let's give them the tools that they need to take this forward, rather than waiting, I don't know, for legal cases or issues and incidents to occur. Let's get on the front foot.
Yeah. Naomi, is that sort of similar to what you've been observing?
Well, I wear a few different hats, so I come at it from a couple of different perspectives. So when Beck talked to me about, the potential pitfalls and considerations, so I thought of it from the regulator's perspective. So sitting on the regulator board, we've seen implementation of other codes not really land, and from a regulatory compliance and enforcement perspective not land. So there's going potential pitfalls there from that approach. Sitting as the chair of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, then we also have a group of people in the profession and their level of knowledge and capability to be able to support businesses and workers and workplaces to implement these codes and take a risk-based approach to something that they might not have spent a lot of time in, given that we generally focus on the physical hazards more so. So there's that piece there. And then there's me as a consultant and supporting the range of businesses that I work with. So I have some small mum and dad businesses with 5 employees, all the way up to big corporates on multiple sites. So how do you support the potential pitfalls of understanding, knowing, training, all of those things, implementing? There's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. And Wade, what about you?
Yeah, key things for me is ultimately, where do I start? What tool do I use? There's a lot of followship around at the moment, and also around how does it connect into the various functions I have to engage with my stakeholders? How do I, give tools? How do I interpret and make sense of all of this? Because you just got over to building capability. Where does mental health and psychosocial come into it? And also, how does this integrate into enterprise risk management? So, when you're discussing with senior stakeholders and they're used to risk appetite statements and risk tolerance and these types of things, how do you translate some of the guidance that's coming out, put it into actionable steps, and then time phase it as to where does it look like, and then throwing in a couple of concepts like what's reasonable, where are we going to see a prosecution, changing regulatory landscape, and then lastly, because it is regulatory-led change, for a lot of industries and a lot of organisations, there tends to be that focus on downside protection versus more upside realisation.
Yeah, so that's there's a lot of complexity in a lot of those questions that you were asking there, Wade, and hopefully we can explore some of that. I don't know that we'll have any answers for anybody today, but I think it's good to recognise the questions that are ahead of us. That I think as a are we an industry? Are we a body of interested people? I'm not sure what we call ourselves just yet, but as a group, they're questions that we'll need to be able to provide answers to in consultation with regulators and unions and
and that's the important thing to note is that we don't operate in a vacuum, right? We're just taking this through. So I think the other thing to note is if you've got a question, who do you go to for guidance? And I think that's some of there's probably lack of guidance on how to do an investigation that covers privacy, IR, fair work, safety issues. How do you broach that? So so there's a lot of stuff here, but we've got to work through it, right? And there's no impending sense of doom, apart from doing the absolute best we can with what we have, with the limited information we know, and taking that step forward. Now, that's not going to be enough for everybody, and there are going to be a lot of people that new legislation and will dive straight to industrial manslaughter. But I don't think that's what any regulator around the country is saying. They're taking a precautionary approach. They're looking at the promotion side of things. They're trying to stitch it together as best they can. And ultimately, it's around we stand on the shoulder of giants of who's done things before. And let's just take those same concepts like risk assessment, like occupational hygiene approach to managing exposure, and let's just work through it.
Yeah, for sure.
I think if I could add in something to what Wade's just said, is I think he's really emphasising that we need a transdisciplinary approach to this. This is not just something that sits in workplace health and safety. There's some amazing expertise that will sit there from the human factors point of view, from a range of other factors point of view. Still a capability build that exists even in that profession. There is some amazing capability we could use in HR that's probably, in my view, not really tapped into. And we need to bring those functions together. It's about bringing legal into the conversation. It's about bringing logistics into the conversation. It's about a whole of business approach. So this is not really something that is just restricted to what does the workplace health and safety team do about these new regs. It's something that actually flows all the way through the business. And if we're going to get it right, we need to throw it all the way through the business right up top, right? So that means getting all of the senior managers on board, not, there's legal, special risk counsel, HR, workplace health safety, all of those different functions of what we do touches. And given that we deal with staff, we deal with the workforce, I would struggle to think if there's the function within a business that this doesn't touch. So if we're going to actually get good solutions, and if we're going to make sure we do, like Wade talked about, something more than just minimum compliance, like how do we tick a box here and maybe escape prosecution, versus how do we actually use it as a value-added proposition, is that really transdisciplinary approach. And that's not just about us. It's not just about us as safety practitioners or HR practitioners or whatever it is. It's about getting the collective involved and getting them all on the same page and saying, how do we solve, if we've got a problem, how do we solve it? And if we don't have a problem yet, how do we actually forward think to make sure we never come across a problem?
And that's probably the key insight to have, is around transdisciplinary. What do we have to offer the conversation, right? And really, ultimately, as a generalist profession, other than if you're in a specific stream, you come with risk assessment knowledge and ability to hopefully undertake a risk assessment, right? So that's probably our biggest point, is to help sense make the various groups together to have that conversation, but also be very clear on when a risk assessment is needed. And often this is what I'm seeing a lot of, is that we need the first thing is we need to do a risk assessment. Well, are people clear on why you do a risk assessment? Don't stop the how question. Okay, you're not there yet. Why are you undertaking an assessment? That's the first part. And then also, if you, instead of jumping straight to a tool, like people at work, have you actually understood that tool and does it fit your level of business and complexity? So to me, framing this conversation is really important to understand what we offer, who we need to have in the room, and then start looking at tools and processes. But you need to, first step of risk assessment, understand your context, right? That's what always is normally missed. So to me, you can't understand the contents of the organisation without understanding your own context, what you bring, where you're coming at this from, and understanding how this change is being seen within your business. And that ultimately unfortunately, can either help or hinder a part of organisational change.
Yeah, and I think an important point that's come through in the model regs is that, the requirement to address psychosocial hazards in the same way as physical hazards. And that, that includes things like having safe systems of work established, and all of those other duties that sit under that sort of primary duty clause. They all then, encompass the psychosocial risk management approaches as well. So yeah, doing a risk assessment in and of itself isn't a safe system of work. It's an activity that you perform on a periodic basis as part of your overall safe system of work. But there are so many other elements of the organisation that go into that, as you do, with physical safety. So yeah, I think that just because it's a WHS duty or reg doesn't mean that you just handball it to your health and safety team to manage. That, it does need a collective effort from across the organisation in the same way as meeting your physical health and safety duties do. Naomi, thoughts?
Oh, I have a very controversial one.
Go for it.
Probably have a lot of psychologists watch this webinar. And the reason being is that I reflect back on COVID. COVID hit, or the pandemic happened, and what did we do? We said, oh, we need the infection control specialists to manage this. And they took a very narrow, their technical specialty approach to it. And it wasn't, as Beck said, transdisciplinary. We didn't really understand, why we were doing workplace risk assessments and all of the complexities involved in that. And so that's, we saw a very much an infection control narrow focus, and we didn't look at generally managing the risks associated with COVID in a workplace, for example. So same again, it shouldn't just be, we'll get a psychologist to implement this, our procedures, because you might just have a very narrow clinical psychology focus and not consider the physical risks that coincide or synergistic effect with psychological. So it does need to be a broad team who looks at this, if you've got a broad team, of course.
Yeah, and that becomes part of the challenge as well, is actually the level of knowledge, subject matter knowledge available in the community at this point in time is fairly limited, as we've found. Wade, did you want to speak some more about sort of this idea of the, I guess, tools and what tools people should be using or the organisations are looking at and think that they should be using?
Yeah. So first one, most people are taking or have in the past taken employee engagement data as a reference point, and any survey, any process where you're gathering data is only as good as the quality that it's designed, who answers, how rich the data source is, and is it actually real, right? Unfortunately, there's an aboutness where if you're asking questions, sometimes people will provide data, subjective data, that's not always aligned to objective standards of measurement. So I think they're really important considerations to understand. And from a tool perspective, don't just reach on the shelf to this is what I need and this is what I do, and put some critical thought in behind it. So I think the first one is understanding, are you trying to find something that's happened and is currently in the organisation? And if you're trying to look at that, you've probably got richer sources of data around your absenteeism. You can get your own data as well as read reports that are available at a population level data. So if you've got enough employees that's represented the population, you don't have to go and look for bullying and harassment. It's going to happen statistically. Unless you're fantastic. My view is around, if you've got a statistically large enough population, you're going to have it in your business. So don't look to find it. Understand what you're going to do about it. And so they're probably points where tools that just look at hazard identification, they're probably not as robust. Really what I'd be looking for is around a tool is, can you pinpoint down to, are they customizable, first off? And secondly, do they actually give you insight to do something about other than generic starting points? So, whilst generic tools are great to start to understand what you're looking with, over time, you're going to become more and more nuanced. And you need to involve, and consult with the workforce to generate a better risk assessment tool and better touch points as well, because risk assessment is a point in time. And unfortunately, this is one of those hazards that does change over time as well. And exposure does change based on seasonal impact. Customers, occupational violence will spike over Christmas, those types of things. So it's not a static hazard. It's not like a generator convincing the same amount of noise. So the selection of tools is really critical. And so whilst you may start generic, please consider, what may give you better level intelligence and data and real world information, so you can make more nuanced discussions around lowering risk or having those discussions either around recovery or thrive.
Yeah, and I think the point around consultation there is well made as well, that it's not just consulting through a questionnaire about, what's your experience of work, but it's also consulting with the workforce about when should we be doing this? How should we be monitoring it? What should we be focusing on? So actually getting them involved in the design of that system of work, as well as seeking their consultation on their actual experience of hazards.
And Peter just raised a really good point in the questions. It's actually you need to risk assess your own processes and practices, right? Sometimes we just look at work as the task or the exposure, but we actually fail to appreciate that our own perceived safe systems of work or design safe systems of work can actually create more risk to our people. It's fairly well reported on around workers' compensation can be quite adversarial, and that can cause further harm when you're putting people into adversarial processes. So, we do need to also understand how our own design of work and our own safe systems of work sometimes don't contribute to those outcomes that we want.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that that sort of feeds into that, the whole concept of work design as being your primary response or intervention when you have identified psychosocial hazards, is that, if it can't be eliminated, you need to look at work design, because primarily the design of work is likely to be the thing that's causing the issues for people. Beck, you have something to say?
Wade raised so many interesting points that I think there were 6 that I counted off the top of my head, and I just want to deal with maybe 1 or 2 of them. And I think you've touched on a piece of the legislation that again, PCBUs are not necessarily that good at being across. So there are identified hazards, and there are many, many issues with things like cultural surveys. Like, to be frank, the average HR survey goes out, and it's really to blow smoke up the backside of the organisation, unless it's really well designed. So I think what we see in engagement surveys, depending, and there's a wide range of variability here. Of course, there's some that are much better designed than others, but like, I don't know that many cultural engagement surveys that say, please tell us if you've been exposed to bullying and harassment or anything that might, be a lead indicator of. They don't tend to ask those questions. So there's that using those engagement surveys for data is it's a source, and we just need to understand the limitations of that source. But Wade, really, you highlighted the fact that there's stuff around what we ought to know. Okay, so this is a part of the legislation where it's not just that the risk was known. Should these things ought to have been known? And particularly if you're a larger organisation, dead set, you can prove to me that you've got multi-source data that says that some of the common psych hazards are not occurring in your organisation. They're occurring. All right, they're occurring. And I don't know if if we look at the really, really common ones, and we might talk about the common ones a little bit later in this conversation, but if we look at the common ones are sexual harassment, bullying, and so forth, and the classic response to say we don't get any complaints, for example, and people don't even know they can make hazard reports, which is a different process entirely. It's to do with reframing everything we do with that particular report. But they'll say, oh, well, we didn't know. And I think that organizations are going to fall into a bit of a pitfall or a bit of a chasm where it's, you ought to have known. I mean, where have you been in the last 5 years with sexual harassment, for example? Have you been under a rock? We've had Respect at Work. We've had bullying before that. We had a parliamentary inquiry into bullying. Like, if you just open up the newspaper any given day of the week, and by that I mean flip open your iPhone or whatever smart device it is that you use, and you read whatever news alerts that you read. But even if you don't have hardcore data in your organization to say, we have identified a hazard, there is this you ought to have known component. And unless you've got an argument against the ought to have known, so industry trends on bullying, harassment, and so forth, unless you can show that your organisation has really robust data to say that that is not going on, then you ought to have known. You didn't need somebody to spell it out. You didn't need complaints to spell it out. And I think that is one of the pitfalls that PCBUs are going to fall into, is this: we knew and we acted on what we knew, right? Versus there's stuff that you ought to have known. Unless you've been living under a rock, you should have known.
Yeah, and that's, I think, something that I've heard from some, organisations that we've been speaking to, that there sometimes is a reluctance to explore these issues because they're afraid of what they're actually going to find, and this whole idea that, well, once we know about it, we have to act on it. But if you take that WHS lens, you pretending that it doesn't exist or trying to claim plausible deniability is not It's not
doesn't
a
work.
valid strategy.
I think it's going to be a real pitfall.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a real pitfall of we didn't know,
Yeah.
and somebody's going to
Naomi,
say,
speaking
well,
from
you
a
should have.
regulatory perspective, I'm sure that you have some thoughts on that approach.
And I do, and I think it's probably going to answer Adam's question as well at the same time. It's always been in the legislation. These regs coming in and these codes is just providing more context and more detail. It's always been there. It just hasn't been regulated and enforced as much as what it is going to be. So to answer Adam's question around, certain stakeholders, and I could guess exactly who certain stakeholders might be in some organisations, are in a hurry to act. I mean, so I've got a couple of points here for you, Adam. First thing would be is to tell them we should have already been managing this. So if we haven't been, then we don't need to rush at this point. Obviously, the regs in Queensland here, 1st of April next year, April Fool's Day, boom, boom. Victoria's are still in draft as well. So from a reg perspective, the laws aren't quite in place yet specifically, but that primary duty is still there. So we can tell them, slow down. Point 2 is let's take our time and plan this appropriately. So Wade earlier jumped straight into tools, but actually before we even start talking about tools, let's plan for hazard ID as per our management standard. Let's plan how we're going to do this, how we're going to do a baseline measurement and understand psychosocial risk in our organisation. That may be a survey, that might be focus groups, that might be one-on-one interviews, but let's plan that out so we've got a strategy in place. That might also be breaking things down. So we might know that we've got cases of sexual harassment or bullying that we need to take them away and deal with them urgently. So they might be something that we individually deal with urgently, but otherwise we go through our planned strategy and process to roll this out. That was where I got to. So hopefully that answers Adam's question as well as that one.
Wade, you look like you had some comments to make.
Yeah, no, that's and when they're saying rush, right? Yeah, it's always the impending. Hey, what are we going to do? There's a new reg, right? And it's like knee jerk. But I love the approach that typically is taken in government. What's the regulatory impact statement? So it's like, hey, what are we going to do? What's it going to change? And often what they're really saying is there's a new reg. Am I going to be prosecuted and what do I need to do? So it's actually, they don't want to assess the risk. They want to just mitigate or minimize their prosecution risk. And so that's a different conversation, right? So if you've got to clarify this with your senior stakeholders, and you say to them, well, hey, are you worried about being a prosecution risk? And openly have that conversation, because typically that's what they want to say it, but they don't want to say it. And often you can bring the legal, external or internal legal teams involved, and ultimately, we've seen through industrial manslaughter prosecutions a bit of an on-running industry joke that if you're on a forklift, you run a business, and unfortunately a fatality happens, and you go into insolvency, you're much more likely to be prosecuted, right? But this is one of those ones that prosecution will likely follow. After there's been repeated attempts or such gross negligence where nothing was done, a la Brodie's case down in Victoria, they're the ones. And so if your senior stakeholders saying, what do? I need to do something now. I think my first starting point is to Naomi's point. What's happening in your business? What are your active workers' comp cases? What are your active complaints? Are you managing that well? Are you using NDAs? How are you using a trauma-based approach? Have you got partners other than just your EAP? So are you looking after your own people? And then do you have a really robust process of allowing people to come to you to say that, hey, there's an issue here, there's a problem, and that can range from sexual harassment down to incivility. Are people clear how to discuss this inside the business, and then do they feel safe to do it? So to me, we've got to unfortunately normalise the reporting of incivility up, not just saying, hey, I've been harmed, I've got a medical diagnosis, and here's my workers' comp claim. That's the first time you hear about it in the business. So to me, yes, back end first, and then slowly move up that way if you're limited for time. But yeah, that's where I'd start right now. Who's hurt and who needs help right now?
Yeah, I think there's this interesting idea of sort of different levels of significance or harm associated with different hazard exposure and sort of different tiers of hazards where, yeah, like incivility, you could almost classify that as like you'd go under a minor hazard reporting kind of a scheme, whereas somebody has sexually assaulted me, that's obviously a very severe incident, and that would actually be classified as sort of a major incident that would need to be investigated as such. And then you've got the other stuff in between that's kind of like adds to the burden. It's not necessarily traumatic or harmful in and of itself, but through prolonged exposure, it sort of just grinds away at you, and it's almost like the last straw. So I think that's something that maybe falls into that category of emerging research and practice that, we might actually get to a point where we're able to have a better understanding of the degree of impact that these different types of hazard exposures actually have on people and how they interact. And there's like Carol Hon is doing some interesting research in the construction industry on that, which was on the episode that aired last week, which was quite interesting. But what I did want to actually talk about, I think there's lots of discussion, and Beck spoke about it earlier, issues of bullying and harassment and violence and those types of things tend to be top of mind when we're thinking about psych hazards. And what I'm actually interested in chatting about today is something that's going to be uncomfortable for everybody to think about and listen to and talk about, but it's what is the intersection between industrial relations and psychosocial hazards. And that's, I think, where we're going to really get some fascinating case studies coming out and some really interesting stuff happening. So a couple of things in particular that I want to talk about, and the first one is insecure work, because this is becoming, I think, a more common issue. So many different varieties of insecure work now occurring, and how is it a psych hazard? What does it mean for people? All of that kind of stuff. So I might, Naomi, I might throw to you first. What are your thoughts on insecure work as a psych hazard?
Thoughts are a lot more questions, just like you said there. There's lots of varieties of insecure work. And so is it the worker choosing to be in, wanting that, not insecure work, but wanting casual employment? So we do see aged care is a very good example. Lots of casual work, but actually a lot of people that I've met, a lot of workers I've met, like the idea of working across 3 different facilities. So they have 3 different casual employers because they get a different variety, the same type of work, but a different variety in different workplaces. So you don't want to take that away from some people also. So is insecure work a psychosocial hazard? I don't think so. I think there's what comes out of it. So whether that's, not getting paid appropriately for the job that they're doing. So then that's that financial issues that they're having in their life that they then bring to the workplace and puts more pressure on them in the workplace to make decisions or work longer hours and then get fatigued. So I think that's a structural piece, but what falls out of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what you've highlighted there is the interaction between I guess the pattern of work or the type of contract you have, but then your level of autonomy in actually deciding or opting into that kind of a work pattern. So, you've talked about people there who have expressed benefits of casual work because of those that autonomy that it gives them and the benefits and protections that it can give them. If we looked at, somebody who didn't have an option for casual work, or they were forced into fixed term contracts that were just renewed every 6 months, or I've seen situations where people were literally employed on a 4-week hitch at a time, and then they would be off work for 4 weeks, and then they would find out 2 days before their next hitch whether they had a job or not. Whereas the employer knew that they had an 18-month contract in place. That does actually start to
absolutely.
So yes, it sort of echoes through other impacts of work as well. Beck, what are your thoughts?
Look, I think this is one of those lesser known psychosocial hazards. So, like the biggies that tend to end up in the media and the things that we tend to talk about. And admittedly, they're the leading causal mechanisms of psych injury. So it makes sense that we're focusing on bullying, harassment, and work pressures. But like if we look at the codes of practice, and again, if we look at the purpose of this particular event, looking at the potential pitfalls that organisations might fall into, would be those lesser known aspects of or lesser known hazards or lesser known aspects that might not be really obvious within those codes of practice. So insecure work is definitely one of them. And so if we look at things like a worker that and the intersect again between AR and safety legislation, I think this is going to be yet another pitfall that PCBUs are going to fall into. So if you only look at it from one perspective, and I think that the dominant perspective at the moment still seems to be Fair Work and IR kind of consideration. So we've seen a range of changes go through and or be proposed or like on foot to do with things like the use of fixed term contracts, for example, is meant to be limited to 2 years in some jurisdictions. There are changes around that have already been accepted around what casual employment means, and it's not to do with the actual employment relationship ongoing. It's to do with whatever you sign an employment agreement to mean. And I have a fundamental issue with that. And then there are a range of other things that intersect on that IR front. And I've noticed that Kieran Strachan has chimed in from South Australia, which is amazing because he's doing a lot of work in trying to reconcile a range of these different issues across the IR, ER, HR, workplace health and safety space. So if listeners are not familiar already with what Kieran is doing, I would suggest to kind of go and have a look and have a look at some of the papers that they're putting out and some of the work that they're doing to try and integrate across the nexes. But if we just look at insecure work, for example, on its own, it might not seem like a psych hazard. And I understand where Naomi is coming from in saying, well, we'll choose. And amazingly, Naomi, you made me reflect back on my honours, which is a long, long, long time ago. And I looked at boundaryless contingent workers and traditional contingent workers. And boundaryless were those ones that were actually really choosing to be casual because it really suited their lifestyle, right? So they could really pick and choose, and it was empowering, and they had agency, right, to do what they were doing, versus those that were in a casual role or a contingent role of some sort, casual being the predominant, but would have preferred to have had permanent work of some sort. And even back then, even my research showed then that it's got an impact on well-being. I won't profess to be across what might have specifically been done in the research since that point. But I think you've raised a really interesting point around work design and agency. So if people are choosing to be contingent and they're choosing to have, they've got agency around that decision, it's very, very different to a person who's actually looking, for ongoing employment and safety and security. And it does become it becomes an individual level risk factor. Because if you're already in that space where you are unsure about things to do with your employment, it actually exacerbates a whole range of other psychosocial factors, right? That we don't really talk about. We don't talk so much about, distributive justice, for example. That's in the codes of practice now. I don't know what PCBU would actually even understand what injustice is about. So I think there's a lot that we could do in this intersect space, that we need to bring these things together and go, this is a hazard, this is an IR issue, let's get these functions talking together about how we actually resolve it.
Wade, I'm interested in your thoughts on this idea of, sort of what's reasonably practicable, what's reasonably foreseeable, and how does that balance when you're looking at things like temporary contracts and sort of long-term casual work and that sort of thing as a PCBU?
Yeah, it's tough, largely because of there's some very real reasons why those roles exist, and why we have an IR framework. And whilst IR framework doesn't sit under safety. Safety actually sits under the IR framework. So as much as I'd like safety to improve and challenge this conversation, which I think it will, ultimately IR is an overarching concept, which is actually a hell of a lot bigger and has macro factors afforded to it. So I think the only thing I'd like to probably draw on is around sometimes, and this is a conversation that comes up quite a lot with duty holders, is where do we draw the line? This choice of, do people get to choose to be part of insecure work? But also it comes down to, well, is your business model built on insecure work, keeping your wages down? So then that's more the time to the ESG side of things, is around, is your business model actually creating a positive social impact in the community? We've already seen, especially around the environmental carbon, sort of areas, investors shy away from areas which doesn't have a positive environment impact or positive social impact. So is this going to be something in future time periods that's probably looked at a lot more closely? Yes, but ultimately the IR is probably going to be more government-led in this area. But I would like to sort of make a call that a lot of people who aren't of a public health background don't have a good understanding of social determinants of health. And Dr. Beck talked about individual risk factors. And this is one thing that I tend to dislike around generic type risk assessment or survey approaches, is that it's hard to get down to this nuanced level. But ultimately, you have to draw a line somewhere where you have to manage the middle of the bell curve, and then manage by exception people that drop out of it. So at-risk groups that unfortunately, have more factors that affect, from social determinants of health, especially rural and regional populations who may not have access to either diagnostic or care, like they do, in city areas. So those types of things need to be taken into consideration for your specific context of the businesses you work within, and allowances made. So things like early worker intervention, those types of things that are often popularised within workers' compensation schemes, we need to start looking at accident and health cover. And if you have that in your business, how do you integrate really good early intervention? How do you integrate programs like Navigator into that process, where you have people that walk people through an adversarial claims management approach and outlook and from a third party and have a look at them? So I think there's solutions out there, but I think also it's not up for us to save everything, and we can't have that view that we're here to save people. We're actually here to educate, support duty holders, make decisions easier for them, to give them the right information at the right time to make better use and better resource allocation decisions.
Yeah, and I think that the point you made there around the sort of, early intervention aspect of it, when we're talking about a psychosocial injury that's potentially compensable, the delay between somebody actually being injured and getting to a point where they're getting compensation through the workers' compensation system is significant. I know there are some organisations introducing approaches that essentially get people into treatment immediately and sort of continue that, covering that in parallel while the claim is being assessed. Is that sort of something that you see more companies considering taking on, that kind of an approach?
Correct. And like at the moment, typically this is often driven by taking a proactive approach, but ultimately premiums drive the impact of what people do. So money talks, right? And unfortunately, the hard thing, if you're in a state scheme associated with workers' compensation, and there are a couple right now that aren't doing so well financially, you're stuck tied to increasing premiums. Whereas in the risk states, for example, you can negotiate based upon your claims and you can take action yourself. So to me, they're sort of things that have gone from a nice to have, or that smart organisations do, to things that are just, it's reasonable now that you need to have these things in place, and have a discussion with your insurer, have a discussion with your broker, how you can get access to this and integrate it as part of your response to your incidents. But also that workers' comp and safety should not be, it shouldn't be two silos. They need to work together. You need to mitigate harm after the actual event has occurred or the exposure has occurred, just as hard as you need to prevent the event. So I often find this baton passing of, well, now it's your side, workers' comp, you can deal with it, where you've got someone who's just put back into the same environment which gave rise to the psychosocial event to start with, right? it's not a bad apple, it's a bad barrel approach. And I think that's probably where we need to reflect upon most as a profession as to we designed very much mechanistic engineering type systems. And we probably need to be more, we need to be more people focused as to how the impact that has. We've gone down a certain part with just culture, especially after incident investigation, not blaming the work of those types of things. This is about having that next level view as to, where the bow tie has a side on the right, which actually we can do a lot of good in. And that's why I'm like, focus there, because it's clinical, it's proven. There's really good knowledge there. There's organisations to help you, like your broker and your insurer. They have the data. It's reasonable for you to understand that, even if you're a safety practitioner and you're not a workers' comp person or you're a HR person, right? The lines are blurred. People don't give a crap which function they go to. They want their problem solved. They want to feel less pain. They want to get better. That's the part of businesses need to focus on. It's about the employee, not whose bloody responsibility or that sort of thing is. Under the Act, it's all one, right? PCBU.
Yep. Naomi, you're nodding and smiling.
I'm disagreeing as well. In a minute part of that, when he said focus on the right-hand side of the bow tie, no, we want to focus on the prevention side. But yes, I do agree. You need to ensure that the right-hand side of your bow tie or your mitigation measures are timely, are effective, aren't re-triggering people. We can't just put a Band-Aid on them and bring them back in and put them in the office and tell them to do photocopying like we do with our physical injuries. So we do need to think about, that, as you say, that gap between raising the incident, having the incident and then workers' compensation claim. How do we bridge that? And we can't just use our current approach that we're using to not have an LTI.
Yeah.
But most businesses, when they record incidents, right, you can throw it under the OC illness category, which some businesses don't even use as part of their TRIFA rates or their LTI rates. Right, and then you go to some organisations that under industry and mining codes that say, well, if you've done all you could for in your safety system, and you couldn't have prevented it, it is what it is. So, and you can exclude it from your stats. So the thing that I would have loved to have seen, and Victoria started down this approach, is reporting events of harm, or when certain categories are done. We've got a massive long list under the code, under the Model Act and regs around when we need to report a physical safety event or a dangerous incident. Funnily enough, none of that exists on the psychosocial side yet.
It's coming.
Correct, which is great.
There's five. There's five proposed in Victoria, but my understanding is it didn't get up with the biannual reporting.
Yeah.
So there was bullying, harassment, occupational violence, aggression, and work pressures. Just off the top of my head, there were five, I think. But I think there was a real, again, if we talk about what PCBUs need to do with the codes of practice and the regulations, I think there was a real lack of clarity around, well, what constitutes an event that's bullying? Does it need to be proven bullying or just a complaint of bullying? At what point, if we're vetting a complaint, at what point do we notify the regulator? And my understanding, there was a lot of pushback around those particular mandatory reporting, the biannual reporting in Victoria. But I think, again, interesting to juxtapose physical injuries and psychological injuries, because we know there's no psychological injuries. It's 5 days or less LTI. They just don't exist. And I think the last time I looked at Comcare data, it was 24% of them were, $500,000+ claims. The median time off work is greater for psych injury claims than it is for even spinal damage and damage. So I think we're dealing with an area of injury/diseases that is really quite complex, and I think the PCBUs are not necessarily across. Well, I'm again, and even where does the report go? So if you have a complaint that goes into HR and somebody says I'm being bullied or harassed, for example, in that really typified bucket, at what point would you notify the regulator, predicting that this could be a serious injury claim, because the legislation usually says you don't need to actually have an injury, you just need to have a notifiable incident, right? So like if we look at it in the physical injury space, you don't need to have scaffolding that's actually collapsed and caused a broken back or bone or whatever it is. You just need to have unsafe scaffolding and it's reported and it's a notifiable incident, right? And again, if we look at the positioning that tends to occur between psych-related hazards and physical-related hazards, we need to be adopting the same level of scrutiny. So if you have something though that comes into HR, I mean, how does HR tell if it's a really verifiable bullying and harassment claim or some sort of otherwise dispute, right? So not actually a psych hazard, but an actual dispute. And then how do they report that to the regulator? And I guess what I've been saying to clients is if you're unsure, contact the regulator and say, we've got this scenario, we don't yet have an injury claim, it's not yet a workers' comp claim, this is what it looks like. Is this notifiable? Because if it turns into a claim, it's probably going to be 42 weeker, right? It's not even going to be a 5-day LTI. It's going to be some astronomical amount of time off work. And I think the PCBUs are really genuinely unsure about what they should and should not report in that space. And I think that was a challenge with the Victorian regs. How do we define this?
And it's not defined, so that's going to make it even more challenging. Heads of the WorkSafe authorities, or Hauser as we call them, are working on that notification clause under the Act. And so
Good
what
to
that
know.
looks like, and adding more about psychosocial harm and what that is, what is notifiable. So that is coming. Now, just with Hauser though, that's, I guess it's volunteer group. So they all the regulators come together, they discuss what they agree on will go into the model laws. Whether those jurisdictions take those laws up verbatim or whether, so often we see here in Queensland, they're not quite the same. They like to have their own take on it, usually better, but they may be slightly different. So we're never going to be harmonised, but close to harmonised. So they are working on that notification clause. I know that for a fact. But can I if I put $5 on the horse, I don't think the first iteration is going to be perfect because we still have the conversation now about the current notifiable with a physical injury. Do we notify? Do we don't? We still have those conversations. So there's going to be teething issues, and I think we'll just work it out as we go along, unfortunately.
So
there's
I'm
more
conscious
expectation
that we
around
are.
transparency, all of those sort of things. So to me, it's around you either choose to wait for the regulation. You're either, if you're in a market or an investor perspective, you're getting more and more of this, the ESG requirements to report and participate in benchmarking. So to me, it's a case of you don't have to answer the question, but fundamentally you can look inside your business and go, if there's evidence of it, what are we going to do about it? So that's the thing to me. While if you know that, we'll start doing something on the right of the curve, and then at the same time, like you said, you don't have to just do one or the other. It's a both and conversation. Operate along the contingency, and that's why I think that the Curtin's Future of Work Institute, that Thrive model, I love that. I love the whole, support, protect, thrive. I think that's fantastic. And that's had some really good conversations or opened up some really good conversations for participants, say, on the HR side of things, because they can see the thrive in there. I know where I fit, right? Oh, you're the protect and support box. Okay, I understand this. I know where I fit. And that's the other part is often if we throw a bit of legislation at a function that's not used to seeing legislation or risk assessments, it's obviously sometimes becomes, oh, well, you sort that out. I don't want to learn.
Yeah. So a few minutes left before we throw it over to questions from the audience. So I think something that I've been noticing is that PCBUs may tend to, as part of this panicked, oh no, I need to be doing something now. They might be asking the EAP to help them with this with the prevention stuff, with the risk management stuff, recognizing that there is a broad variety of EAPs out there with varying skills and levels of competence and people and services. Let's frame this in a proactive way. If organisations were seeking to contact their EAP about this, what questions should the PCBU be asking the EAP to determine if the EAP is competent to help them with this? Whoever wants to go first can go first.
Look, I'll give it a crack. Well, if they're already an EAP service providing, they might be able to give some guidance as to, without disclosing private information, but some aspects or some risk factors that the company should focus on. Particularly, they might be able to advise on that. So that would be the immediate advice that EAP service could give. But I go back to what I first said, is that it's not just, you don't just need psychologists to give you the answer. So they are one part of the solution. So that you need to know what resources that you have in-house or have available to you, and then work out in that planning of hazard ID who to go to. So questions you might ask them are, I'm quite structured, so I would go back to the code and say, all right, there's 16 risk factors in the code. What can you help with? They may not have a human factors background, so work design might not be a good thing for them, but certainly bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, those aspects, they could be very good in supporting. So what's their strength, and what can they bring to the table? Beck, you had a big giggle.
Look, I think I've probably spoken in a context about my view on EAPs in general, like in the framework of risk management. So I think we need to understand that, generally speaking, EAP it's a tertiary level strategy. It's a mitigate illness strategy. And I get that at least some EAP providers are trying to offer services in the early intervention kind of space, but they're not really, look at their name, employee assistance, right? So even the program name suggests that there's harm being done and you're in a mitigate harm, mitigate illness effect kind of space. I would love to see EAPs in general be a lot more upstream, and I can't answer whether it's just a restriction of their contract or a restriction of their capability or anything else. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know. I just can only talk generally speaking about the services that they offer, and the services that they offer are generally they're not reaching, they're employee driven. So an employee has already said, I'm suffering harm or I'm suffering an issue and I'm going to come to you. And they're in the rehab space. And I have a fundamental problem with that. So I think if we look at a risk matrix of being primary prevention, early intervention, tertiary intervention strategies, and if we look at individual level risk factors, and we look at work context and work environment factors, the EAPs in their most generic sense have a place. They have a place in, typically speaking, only one or two cells and only part of those cells in the 9-by-9 matrix. So I just think that EAPs should know their place. I think that if you're going to examine what your EAP is doing, I'd be really asking them questions around what is their upstream service. So rather than waiting for an employee to reach in, what are they doing to reach out? And what are they doing to reach out in a really proactive fashion? So I don't know, you might be paying a blanket amount for X number of one-on-one sessions. You're assuming that the person who's reaching out at that point is already suffering in some way, shape or form, right? So what is that EAP doing in that really upstream service provision model of being there, helping you build capability within the organisation, doing sessions around the topics that we've been talking about, right? And the influence on psychological health and safety, which is different to psych safety. That was a point from earlier on that I think we could probably differentiate if we come back to it. But what are they doing in that upstream space? And there are a lot of EAPs that are getting paid to have reach out services when we know the data says they're typically trusted by employees and they're not harnessed. I think that the highest level of uptake that I've seen is 15.6%. Loosely speaking, I do some work with legal. I know that it's well below 3% uptake, and yet these services are being paid for. So I guess that my takeaway from that would be, if you've got an EA provider, I'd be asking what they're doing in the upstream service model. You're paying for this service. What are they doing in the prevention space that is reach out, not relying on harmed workers or vulnerable workers to be reaching in?
Yep. Wade, your thoughts?
Don't ask a fish to climb a tree. Well, ultimately, we put the contracts to an EAP as organisations, and ultimately we accept a service. Yeah. So, to be fair, is around, if we view them as a one-trick pony, they are a one-trick pony. But I think they do have more parts to play and offer, and often they can assist in areas where things may be reported as work-life issues, and life affects work. So I think they've got a lot to offer in that space. They have a lot to offer in the fact that there is anonymity, there is privacy, there is those types of things. Yes, I guarantee probably there's higher uses of EAP than whistleblower lines. So it's how you structure it, right? I think they're part of the mix. I ultimately think they play an instrument in the orchestra. How many instruments is really up to you, and what capabilities they put on the table. So, but they are part of a solution, right? And this comes back to that, the wearing the bow tie, and also outside of the bow tie in just life in general, right? So I suppose I'm more critical at how and when they're engaged, and what scope they're given, and do they have the capability to do that scope? And I think everyone needs to make their own assessment as to how forward thinking and what capability are in their EAP.
Yeah, I think that's the important point, is that, if you're going to your EAP for strategic advice in how do we go about doing this psych health and safety thing, then you need to first establish that the EAP, it actually has the capability to give you that advice, that they have competence in that. And I think that those are the important questions to explore with them up front before you try to engage them in that kind of strategic work.
And not just EAP.
And many of them are
consultants as well. Yes, Naomi, that's right. And to go back, I think, to what Beck was saying earlier about snake oil, there's lots of people out there who've seen the regs coming. They've seen ISO 45003. They've gone, hey, there's a market here for me to sell into. I'm going to now dress myself up as a workplace mental health expert, even though I don't really know what I'm talking about. So yeah, lots of things to be concerned about there for sure. All right, so we've got a question from the audience. Is a peer support network a legitimate psychosocial risk management intervention?
Ooh. I've seen them work well.
Who wants to take it?
I've seen them work well, and I've seen them not work well. So, yeah, I think it depends on your business context. It might work very well. It might not.
Where does it sit in the risk management framework? And if you're using it to try to be an early intervention, I call it all clean up the mess strategy. So early intervention, support, recovery strategy. Are you across the vicarious harm issues that you create by creating this? Because there's a lot to do with the people that would volunteer typically to be in a peer support network. And if you're looking at people role fit and risk reduction from the really front end, the people who would volunteer to usually be mental health first aiders or whatever. I'm not saying they're not suitable. I'm saying you need to have a structure to determine who goes into those roles and whether they're suitable for that role or not. And even if they're suitable for that role, it creates a secondary trauma, vicarious harm risk. So yes, they are a psychosocial risk management intervention. You need to understand where they fit, and you need to understand the risks that come along with deploying them.
Yeah, excellent response, Beck. Wade, did you have anything to add to that?
I'd agree, especially around where you're constrained around, you can't eliminate psychosocial risk. I mean, defence, various other forms of, police, those types of areas use them quite effectively. It is how they're set up, deployed. The only thing I would state is that sometimes people are quite attracted to those roles because they want to add support and guide, and they sometimes overstep their role as a peer support person, and they sometimes drop into counsellor treatment mode. So you need to build in those assurances on those processes so that doesn't happen. So I think ultimately,
there's a lane.
It's how it's designed.
Yeah. And it's certainly...
Stay in your lane, be clear about what the lane is, and have the support systems in place to support, to stay in their lane and operate in their lane.
Protect them from vicarious trauma. Keep them.
First aider doesn't amputate someone's ankle.
No,
they have to stay in their
doesn't
lane.
remove somebody's appendix.
Yes. I've got an answer for this question already because I saw it earlier in the list.
All right. So given there is so little research around effective organisational level interventions or controls for managing psychosocial hazards, how do we help organisations develop these? Take it away.
Take it away. All right. First thing is, what is an effective control? So effective, in my mind, some of the things I wrote down, effective controls are controls that are fit for purpose, that there's ownership. So people know who's got to implement them, who has to use them. So there's ownership in that they are used and maintained, that they're monitored regularly for their effectiveness, and they're continually improved. So once you establish that criteria for effective controls, then my approach as a consultant across various types of businesses, and given that there is little research, you need to identify what's going to be fit for purpose for that business, and then help them implement that, and make sure it's going to work for them. So it's a journey that you've got to take them on. There's no, it might be people at work for one business, but it might not be for another. So that's where that expertise and that capability comes in, to be able to guide them with what's going to work for them in their context.
Wade?
I'm just trying to understand organisational level interventions, and understand the concept of I suppose I always go to old construction days of how do you reduce risk in a construction project? Don't do night shift. Don't accelerate the schedule. So typically it's around the load you put on people, and so ultimately is how do you create a resilient business that doesn't transfer the load of market conditions onto individuals, and ultimately you put in place things like succession planning, like capability building, and you build that in before people actually take increased roles onwards. So to me, organisational level interventions, it's really, can you do anything that sort of does that? I understand. Probably not do mergers and acquisitions. They're pretty stressful. So yeah, I understand there's that, but that to me is put you at a business level perspective, put yourself in a position where you can act ahead of time before the exposure comes. That's why there's so much lack of research. So to me, yeah, that's probably the best, but a lot of it does put at either the individual leader level or, work design's bloody hard.
Yeah, and it's bloody hard to measure the effects of it as well in a way that can be published in a peer-reviewed journal.
And there's so much variability. So, yeah.
Yeah.
In some ways, I kind of think of this, like one org level, it can mean a massive workforce for some bigger organisations. So I don't think that org level is necessarily a good unit of analysis for risk assessments more generally. I think that you need to understand your business and understand where you need to cut and slice the data to get a realistic view on what your risks and hazards are, and therefore what your hazards and your interventions might look like. And then your classic pre and post, if you're going to put something in place, Do you have perhaps some metrics? And not everything can be captured in metrics, but do you have some metrics in place where you can go, we're putting in an intervention? Can we track what we would expect based on research evidence or wider evidence that this particular intervention should result in, right? But also I'm kind of in some ways drawn to the whole argument about RCTs. And do you know what? Organisations are complex. Even at 100 employees, they're complex because there's 100 different individuals in that organisation. If you get to the point where you've got 27,000 or 35,000 employees, that level of complexity goes through the roof, right? And, you know, we don't have RCTs on these. We don't have randomised controlled trials on it. There are so many factors that can influence what an outcome might look like. And I think if we're going to get psych risk management correct, we need to understand that it is an intersection. It's the individual, the work and their work environment. And yes, we have some really good data and some really good evidence from peer-reviewed research that will give us some really broad tips to go on. But if you're looking for a randomized control trial, it's like saying, oh, I don't know, it's a little bit, for want of being a little bit contentious, masks in COVID. Are we going to do a randomized control trial? Well, no, we're not. Because, you know, it's like, do we need a randomized control trial to understand that a parachute works if you fall out of an aeroplane?
But Dr. Bex, there was some really good stuff done in Comcare. There was some really good stuff done around early intervention. So that to me is probably one org level. If you can pull that forward, you can then rely upon the clinical guidelines. You can do that. Yes, it's not on the left side of the bow tie, but at least
put these pieces together. Put them together. You don't need to have something that's perfect for your organisation, but you need to have some sort of evidence to show that it should might work. Don't just pluck, you know, something out of the air, some snake oil, and go, let's hope for the best with this.
Yeah. And this is where we, as scientist practitioners, those of us who are psychs or other sort of in those types of disciplines, this is what we do. We look at what research is available. We look at the context that we need to apply it in, and we make a decision drawing on our experience, drawing on our peer networks to say, well, this is what we think will work. And here's how we're going to try it. And here's how we're going to try it in a way that we believe is going to be as safe as possible while we're trying it. Here's how we're going to measure whether or not it's effective. And at this point, we'll make a decision about what to do next. That's the scientist practitioner model in practice. And that's what we do when we don't have enough evidence to be able to inform how to move forward.
Yeah.
What was that next question, Jason? What should HR do if they observe a 70% increase in EAP usage by staff? They should be pleased that staff are aware of the EAP and are making use of it. That's my initial response. I think that there's no clear conclusions to be drawn from that. Like, we know that it's really difficult to access psychs sort of through the public system.
A survey either.
Yeah, well, that's it. Yeah.
Is it for personal or work purposes? Because that's the really common when we look at EAP data. The first bit that they do, is it for personal or work? And well over 70% is my observation across multiple organisations. Industry level analysis is well over 70% is usually in that personal space. So then you've got to look at what is the org data and the intersex. But it's like if we want to address bullying and harassment, for example, we need to welcome reports. The reality is it's going on, it's under the carpet, and an actual positive metric is if we put mechanisms in place to encourage reporting, is you would see an uptick in reporting. That's actually a success measurement. And I think this is where we need to be really careful about the metrics that we're using and how they're interpreted. Because if you're doing something like a change management program around increasing psychological safety, if you increase psychological safety, you should see a big uptick in reports of all sorts. really over time, if you've had a chance to address what those reports have raised, then do you see a decrease? So I think, again, we need to be really clear in what is it that we're actually measuring and why, and not have this narrow, lower is better, like zero harm.
Yeah. So, I would generally say that more is better, and we shouldn't be alarmed if people are accessing the EAP, because that's why it's there. But certainly look at the monthly reporting that you're getting from your EAP. And if they're not giving you good data, then insist on better data, at least around, is it personal? Is it work related? And if it's work related, what are the main categories that are coming through?
Hey guys, I've jumped back in. It's been a fascinating discussion. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I don't know if you want to talk about key takeaways from this, because there's a lot of ground that we've covered.
Good call, Jason. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. I sort of want to wrap it up and bring a small business lens back to it a little bit as well. So I've recently been to the Houses Small Business Forum for implementing psychosocial risk management. They don't have the answers either, particularly for small business. So they are identifying small business as a high-risk area predominantly, probably because capability and resources aren't there. They don't have HR. They don't have safety resources in their businesses. So I would suggest that regulators will be focusing on small and medium-sized businesses more so. So if you are in that space, you might get more attention. That said, they're also providing more resources in that space as well. So the small business advisors and however they label them across the jurisdictions. There are heaps of resources that they're providing. The manufacturing resource kit out of New South Wales is online. It's very good, and you probably can take it out of a manufacturing context and learn from that. Victoria have the Work Well toolkit, which Victoria are reporting is highly reactive use at this point. So people are going there because there's an issue. Tasmania have a Head for Work program. It's an online training program, online training tool. So if you're looking for something in that space, South Australia are about to launch in November, they're telling us, Healthy Workplaces Service. So that's a service to all workplaces in South Australia that will be able to engage in that service for support. ACT are coming along, so not much to report in that space, but they have been a bit more compliance focused. So look out if you're in the ACT. Although they do say their young worker portal has now also thought about young workers' psychosocial hazards in workplaces in small business. So there's a piece there if you're in that niche category. And of course, Queensland have just launched their code, their regs coming. And so there's a whole heap of tools coming out of Queensland as well. How's that?
Anything from WA?
No, they're not on the list here for some reason.
That's all right. Classic.
Wait a while, Naomi. And then they
these...
hit you with like an amazing code of practice that includes insecure work and smacks everybody for 6.
WA is so in WA the AIHS has partnered with a provider to do some training for DMIRS. So that is coming. If it's not, I should know the details, but it is there. So Google it.
That's with FIFO Focus. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for sharing those resources. Key takeaways for you, Wade, from today.
I think it was a question around what to do if a senior stakeholder wants to do something. And that to me is around focus on the harm your business is already creating. Go and look for it, know it, bring people together, see if you can do better. And I think challenge through your enterprise risk process, if you're in a large business, what's the tolerance for this? Tolerance tends to dictate, and then what's the upper threshold that'll be tolerated? So I think have that discussion, pull it down. That will then provide resources for you to undertake further either focus groups, risk assessments, use of tools that actually look at frequency, duration, a more of a hygiene-based approach, and then sort of take a view to try and pull this all together. I know it is very challenging. There are a lot of pieces. Ask your peer group what they're doing. see who's getting good results. Joel, you made a really good case for just taking one step forward, doing better. I think that's really important. And ultimately, I think also don't ask system actors to do more than what they're capable of, and understand your own limitations. So there is good guidance around risk assessment, but risk assessment is not the start nor the end of the discussion. It's about a multi-factor approach to getting better. It's about you getting better as an individual. And clearly it's quite a challenging subject. You don't need to be an organisational psych to have an opinion in this space. You don't need to, be a human factors person. You just need to be able to know where to go and get that support. So to me, yes, maybe measure thrice, cut once, and maybe do less cutting, but definitely spend the time in understanding what's your next step forward. But ultimately that's going to be driven by your stakeholders as well as the guidance out there, and start where you can. Don't feel bad that you're starting maybe at the back end, or maybe if going at the front end, whatever. Just, I think any form of attention to this space, provided you follow an evidence-based practice, following the the risk-based approach, is going to serve you pretty well.
Awesome. Beck, your takeaways.
I'd like to probably build on both of those sets of really amazing takeaways, and I hope the audience has really drawn something from this conversation. I think that, like, building on what Wade has just said specifically, and back to some other earlier stuff that we talked about, it's transdisciplinary. So this is not just an issue that we need to be talking about in safety. It's certainly not just an issue that needs to be talked about in HR. We need to actually be collaborating. And if you want it to be on the agenda higher up in that value added space, rather than just compliance in the second half, if you want it to be in that value adding space, then we need to bring multiple voices and multiple stakeholders into the conversation. There was another really valid point, and we've talked about it throughout the sector, is evidence-based. Just don't go out and buy a product or a service or training or this or whatever else it is, but put a little bit of more research and more evidence behind what you're doing. And the reason I encourage you to do that is I have a fundamental problem with organizations wasting money on anything. Okay, so you know what, if you invest in training, you're going to invest in a program, at least have something that you think has got a pretty good chance of actually working. So avoid the snake oil, try to do evidence-based. And I think then too, also, it's not just about compliance. Like, you can really fall into this just tick a box for compliance kind of regime. And I think everybody on this panel has emphasized that it's like, yes, it's an imperative, but it shouldn't be the only imperative. And the real value add is actually in going beyond compliance. That's going to be the forward-thinking employer of choice. It's going to be the talent acquisition. It's going to be the positive employee value proposition. It's going to be a whole range of things that are going to mean a lot to business. And it's going to mean a massive reduction in business more generally. So I think that that's really where the conversation needs to be, is less about what do the regs tell us what we should do, and let's have more of a conversation about what we could do and how far it could get us.
Yep. So for me, my takeaway, or I guess what I hope that listeners would take away from this, is that we are in a marathon. We're not in a sprint. It's not, we do something once and quickly and then we don't need to worry about it again. So it is about taking your time, thinking about what you're doing, developing your strategy, using the information that you have available. And maybe in parallel, you start looking at what's causing harm and focusing on that, whilst at the same time you're focusing on your higher level strategy and actually working in something that's going to embed into your processes and become part of business as usual, so that it's not something you have to keep reminding yourself to do, that it's just embedded in how you do your business every day. All right. I can see Jason popping back in.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That was a terrific panel. I knew that would be high caliber when we put the panel together. Well, when Joelle put the panel together, let's face it, I just turned up to say hello. That's pretty much it. But look, it was great. Thank you to the attendees who came along as well and added some questions. Big shout out to Adam Nebbs for asking some good ones that got featured. So thanks, Adam. But guys, thank you again to Beck, Wade, Naomi. Thanks, guys. And I guess probably sign off now. Hey, Joelle.
Yeah, it's smack on the half hour. So let's let the East Coast get on with their dinner.
East Coast? No, they'll be going to putting the kids to bed by now, won't they? Hopefully. And Wade's got a plane to catch as well. So thank you, everyone. So just remember, we will be making this video available on our podcast, the Psych, Health and Safety podcast, over the coming days. So keep an eye out for that to the regular listeners. We'll also have this available on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. So you can check that out post the event. And then, when you're over on LinkedIn, you'll notice that we'll probably put a clip or two up over the coming week as well of some of the insights that our panelists have given us. And feel free to connect with myself, Joelle, or any of the fellow panelists as well on LinkedIn and continue the conversation over there. And don't forget to join the Flourish DX community if you want access to these resources ahead of time. And we'll hopefully add some of those great links that Naomi was referring to as well, because there's so many great resources out there. But that brings us to the end of the panel. Thanks again to our panelists and attendees. We'll catch you next time.
You've been listening to the Psych, Health and Safety podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych, Health and Safety podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.